Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you find yourself today. We are so glad you've joined us for this Church Goes Global conversation. My name is Andrew Gale.
And I am Nate Tapman, and we are so thankful that you have decided to join us today. Before we get into today's topic, we want to remind you why we invest the time and energy to bring you these conversations about the church, and then how you can engage during this webinar.
So Church Goes Global, the whole premise behind it is that this webinar looks at current cross-cultural issues through the lens of the local North American church and their engagement in the world. So we invite guest speakers to share from their experience and their expertise. So we're thankful to have Esther with us today. And they're going to connect us back to how the local church can be on mission in the world.
Yeah, and if you've never been a part of a Zoom webinar, there's just a few pieces of information that might be helpful for you. First of all, this session is being recorded, and you will be able to find it on the Global Strategy resource page and the Global Strategy Facebook page in the next week. We do take questions, and they are welcomed and encouraged. Feel free to write a question and send it in at any time, and these questions are not visible. So as you type in your questions, actually only Andrew and I will be able to see them, and we'll respond to them. And then there are other features like polls that we may utilize as well, and we definitely welcome your participation on that. On our next session, just to give you a heads up, will be on April 17th, and we will be joined by Samir Salibi. There's Samir's picture with his son, I believe, Max. And Samir is in Paris, France, and he has a ministry called At Home that reaches out to reaches out to refugees. And so we're going to talk about the global refugee issues and some of the things happening in that area. So for all of these webinars, we always want to bring the focus back to the local church and how it impacts and affects the local church.
Yep. Absolutely. So we're going to start today. We are joined by the wonderful Esther Jadhav. We're so thankful that you are with us. Esther is the Assistant Vice President for Intercultural Affairs at Asbury University. She's also a PhD candidate at Asbury Theological Seminary. And on top of that, she's an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church and serves on a regional level for this. Is it the state of Kentucky? Is that right?
It is the state of Kentucky, but also the United States at large. So I serve on a couple boards with the U.S. as well.
Awesome. So Esther, we're so glad to have you join us today and excited to learn from you and listen to some of the things you're processing as you're working on your PhD work.
Thank you, Andrew. It is a joy to join your community today, and I hope that what I have to share with you, which is a cumulative of my experience and of my academic training. So I trust that it will be helpful to your clergy, your pastors, and for those involved in ministry.
Perfect. So Esther, I shared a little bit about what you're doing currently, but we'd love to hear some about your background. Can you talk more about kind of who you are and what brings you to where you are today?
How much time do we have, Andrew?
Keep it short. We got a lot to get through.
Okay, then I will just try to hit the highlights or perhaps things that are more pertinent to our conversation this morning or afternoon. So like Andrew said, I am Esther Jadhav, and I grew up in Mumbai, which is located in India. And I grew up in a Christian home. And majority of my upbringing was in the context of a pluralistic society. And what I mean by that is I grew up around people of other religions. So if you look up India, if you do a Google search on India, one of the first few things you will see that it is a pretty vast country and has a lot of diversity, which bleeds into linguistics, which bleeds into culture, which bleeds into food, which bleeds into beliefs and practices. So I grew up in a context where this cultural diversity was very pervasive and present in a good way. And so I grew up with that. in a Christian home. So my dad is also a Methodist clergy working in India and has devoted a significant part of his life in serving the church in India for now about 50 plus years. So I walk into that heritage and into that experience. And now I get to live some of that here in North America. So before coming to the US, I was able to do much of my academic work in Jesuit institutions, was working on a master's in anthropology when I was accepted by Asbury Seminary for an MDiv degree. So I came to the US about 20 years ago and was able to pursue my academic work as well as ordination in the United Methodist Church through the Kentucky Annual Conference. And somewhere in the back of my mind, there was always this lingering presence of an invitation to be a missionary. It was as early as age 6 when I started to formulate a desire to be someone who is traveling and preaching and teaching the Word of God. So that theme has been present with me for a long time. And so it ushered me into the work I currently do. So with an academic background in anthropology, sociology, and theology, I was able to step into this work at Asbury University about 16 years ago. So I have been serving Asbury University, like I said, for 16 years now. But I have also been quite involved and present in the life of the church as a pastor of a congregation, and I continue to serve on several boards nationally and internationally for the United Methodist Church. So trying to keep it short, Andrew, so there's a little bit of context.
Yes, you're not very busy. You sound like you have a lot of free time. Would you like to work on a PhD or something?
I would like to finish the dissertation for sure. So
Yeah,
now that you've all heard I'm in the middle of this writing work, now you're all expected to pray for me that my work is done.
I think we can commit to doing that.
Okay.
So today we're talking about cultural competency, and it's really great that, I mean, already from your history, we can see where anthropology, sociology, theology all kind of interplay. And I think cultural competency draws on a lot of those different, at least cultural competency within the framework of the church, certainly draws on those different elements. And can you tell us a little bit about the background of that idea of cultural competency? It's also called CQ. Last webinar, we talked about EQ, emotional intelligence, and CQ is cultural intelligence, cultural competency, but it'd be great to get kind of a foundation. When did that originate? What is it exactly? When we say cultural competency, what do we mean? What should we think about?
Sure. That's a great question, Andrew. And I think I'd like to kind of broaden the view into this answer. And what I mean by that is perhaps give you a little bit of context to the concept of cultural intelligence, because I think it is closely connected to the emerging of contextual theology, which, Andrew, you probably recall from the work that we did together, that contextual theology really became a thing not too long ago. It was in the 1960s. So what has it been, 50, 60 years? It's only been about 50 or 60 years that the recognition has come to contextual theology. Now you may wonder, what is contextual theology? It's not a very commonly known concept yet. I wish that it was. Richard Niebuhr, who is a theologian from North America, he has a book titled Christ and Culture, and he talks about the value of culture in an appropriate relationship to theology. So one without the other would really weaken the impact. If theology was not considered in the context of culture, and if culture was not understood through the lens of theology, I think we perhaps might have an anemic approach to the mission work that we do. So to simplify this concept of contextual theology, scholars agree that we need to pay attention to the context in which we find ourselves in. So for example, an urban context would be different from a rural context. That would kind of be one of the examples that stands out in my mind. The North American context would be very different from the context that I come from, like India, or for that matter, the context that you find yourself in. It would be interesting to know the context that you all represent, but I'm confident that we can each identify a unique element or aspect of the context in which we get to serve. So I want to talk about CQ in relation to contextual theology. So what CQ has really done, cultural intelligence, emerged not too long ago. It's been a market term, I believe, for about 25 some years now. And CQ was developed by David Livermore, and you can find his work. Actually, if you just Google CQ, you will find that they have their headquarters in Michigan, and they work out of there. And David Livermore has a book he put out called Cultural Intelligence. And Andrew, actually, you were the one who brought it to my attention when we were doing, when we were doing our doctoral research projects, like trying to identify topics. So David Livermore brings to our attention, yes, thank you, Andrew, that is the book. So cultural intelligence, the definition of that is one's capacity to be able to relate to others from cultures different from self, backgrounds different from self. So cultural intelligence is really the skill set that one can work towards in knowing how to relate with persons who are different from ourselves. So that is kind of the simplified explanation of what CQ really is. And within that, CQ is broken down into a couple different categories. So cultural intelligence, one can start working towards becoming an individual, becoming a person of cultural intelligence, when we start to become aware of the fact that there are realities that are different from our own. Oftentimes we forget, perhaps because we're so consumed with our own worlds, that there is a world outside of our own world. So the first step in CQ is the awareness of a reality that exists outside of oneself. The second step in CQ is the knowledge component. And what that means is when I become aware of a different reality, when I become aware that India is not the entire world, when I become aware that North America is part of our world, when I become aware that Spain is a part of our world, when I become aware that Nigeria is a part of our world, then I need to start to educate myself on what does that world comprise of. So who are the people that live there? What are their values? What are their beliefs? What are their practices? So on and so forth, right? So you've got awareness, you've got knowledge, and then you've got action. And what that really means is it's really referring to now starting to find appropriate ways in relating to persons that are coming from these different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. I almost feel like I want to pause and ask if there are any questions, but I know that questions will come at the end. But that is kind of a very elementary explanation of what CQ is. And I'm happy to go in more depth once we get to the questions part of it. Maybe some of our participants may have more questions.
That's really helpful, Esther. That gives a good foundation. And for those watching, you're welcome to ask questions anytime. As Nate said, we can filter those as once we get to the question section. So Esther, you have another passion. You're also interested in Wesleyan theology, I believe. So tell us about what you mean when you talk about Wesleyan theology and why that interests you.
That's a great question, Andrew. Again, I think I want to broaden this question a little bit. About 4 or 5 months ago, I came across a book titled The Soul of the University. And I am failing to remember the name of the author, but a very popular scholar put this book together titled The Soul of the Christian University. And in that book, there was discussion of the significance of theology in the work of cultural competency. And I have come across very little work that's been done that connects theology to the conversation of culture. So I have a hunch and I have a conviction that the biblical text really sets the tone, gives the mandate, the invitation to go and reach people. When Jesus gave the call to his disciples to go and baptize, there were no limitations on where they went, right? So the going was an open boundary. And so I firmly believe that there is a close relationship between theology and one's ability to be culturally competent. And I believe that our faith really invites us to be persons who are able to relate with people with a sense of empathy, with a sense of compassion, with a sense of understanding, with a sense of awareness. And so I just wanted to mention that while Wesleyan theology is a passion for me, it is really embedded in this broader context that theology and culture are really associated very closely in my mind. So in terms of Wesleyan theology, I'm sure you're familiar that Wesleyan theology comes out of John Wesley's work, who is the founder of Methodism. And because I have grown up in the Methodist Church, I have really been interested in identifying and understanding how does a Wesleyan understanding of the Christian faith encourage me, or for that matter, discourage me in my walk to becoming a more culturally competent person. And so growing up in India, in the Methodist Church in India, I think some of the work of becoming culturally competent was easy because I was living in the midst of rich diversity. I have learned after coming to North America that not all of our regions are as culturally diverse as you would find in India, right? And so I am discovering that there might be some real-time limitations to one's ability to be exposed to a person of another cultural or ethnic background. And students, I work at Asbury University, and students have often shared with me that they come from predominantly white schools, or they come from predominantly white neighborhoods, and there is no presence of the other in the areas that, you know, that they have grown up in. So I started to make the connection then that the lack of the presence of the cultural other cannot be an excuse to me remaining culturally incompetent, because of the foundation or the conviction that I just shared with you earlier, that the biblical text embodies the invitation throughout, from the Old to the New Testament, that we are to be in relationship with the other. You know, the greatest commandment even boils it down further for us: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all of your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so we need to start asking the question of not just who is my neighbor, but how do we define who is my neighbor? Because even this concept of neighborly relationships look different from context to context. So for example, when I grew up in India, we grew up with the front door to the house being open. So people could walk in anytime, knock on the door, come in, say hello. People could just visit you on the spur of the moment. In North America, that is not so much the practice. People do not leave their front doors open. We have to make appointments to be able to visit someone. Although that is very different once you have built a trusting relationship with someone, right? Or for example, when Andrew and Autumn were in Wilmore, because of the relationship, the trust, and the time that we had with each other, I could just text Autumn and Andrew and say, hey, are you guys at home? Like, can I just swing by? So we do those kind of things, but it looks different, right? So I think it is important for us to recognize that the lack of the presence of the culturally other is not an excuse, because the biblical text has in it, embedded in it, the invitation to be able to love our neighbor as ourselves. So I'm sorry, Andrew, because I'm very passionate about this.
No, I can hear you start preaching, Esther. I mean, you are ready to go. We need to get you a pulpit, and you know, you would be all over it.
Yes, I mean, oftentimes when I'm in pulpits in North America, I do invite the congregations to think about how are we interpreting the biblical text? Mm-hmm. Because our interpretation also matters. And I think we need to understand that our interpretation is only partial, mm-hmm. meaning our culture influences the way in which we interpret and understand. Absolutely. And does then respond to that which we understand and see. Yeah. Right? So
well, yeah. I think that's why contextual theology is so important, because it starts to fill in maybe some of those places where our theology is, our reading of scripture may be lacking, or we may misunderstand something. But you know, something connected that I just thought of as you were talking is the biblical text itself is a multicultural document. It was written over, you know, millennia in 2 different languages from multiple different cultural backgrounds. And so sometimes we approach it as if it's all one monocultural community. And even though, you know, we're talking about, you know, the Jewish people, which has a culture in of itself, it's over a long period of time where there's lots of changes, both in contextual changes of where they are, geographical changes, as well as authority and who's in charge and government and all these things that play into the way that scripture is written. That understanding the multicultural nature of scripture, I think, forces us to step back and say, You know, we have to approach the text with more caution, because we may not understand the different nuances of that culture, you know, as we engage it. Not that we have to be afraid of it, but we have to recognize, as you said, that our interpretation is always going to be partial, you know.
Yeah. And, you know, just to give a couple more practical examples, I remember when I first started working at the university, which was back in 2002, I was the coordinator for intercultural programs back then. And I remember that in my effort to help this campus community grow in its cultural competency, cultural responsibility, there were a lot of questions that were coming up. So students would ask me, in fact, this happened to me, where a student stopped me on the sidewalk and said, "How do I speak to someone who is a Muslim?" Now, if you keep in mind my context, that question really surprised me, because I thought, what do you mean when you say, "How do I talk to a Muslim?" Because I was thinking in my mind, just talk to them like you would any other person, right? But then the fact that it is different from what the student had ever experienced or had known, they needed to find out what do I need to do to make sure that I do the right thing. And I think oftentimes for us in North America, I have discovered that unless, how should I say this, Andrew? We are afraid, or we don't want to hurt other people. Like, we don't want to speak in a way that will hurt someone. But oftentimes our desire to find the right way of speaking, or the right content, you know, the words and the nonverbal cues, in the effort of finding the right things, we really don't even make the effort to reach out. So that shouldn't be a limitation, because I have heard a lot of people say, well, I can give my money to missions, but I really wouldn't know how to work in that context. But if you haven't put yourself in that place of building those blocks of awareness and understanding and action, we're not going to know. So that was, you know, that was one of the examples that came to mind.
Yeah, that's great.
I have been engaged in this work, that we really do have an opportunity, but we also have a challenge in North America, because one of the things that I have discovered in being in higher ed, and specifically in Christian higher ed, that oftentimes the work of cultural competency, or the work of working with people who are from a different cultural and ethnic context, appears to have an association of being a political agenda. And I am not quite sure, actually I am very sure, that it is not a political agenda. It may have become a political agenda in our context, but it is not a political agenda. It is a biblical invitation. And so there are so many things that nuance, you know, they make this concept more complex and more nuanced. And so we have to help people understand that honoring the other, working with the other, respecting the other is not a political agenda. It is a biblical invitation. So Andrew, I've probably gone in many different directions. So please bring us back to where we need to center on.
No, this is great. So, you know, another question I wanted to ask was about your research is about the intersection of Wesleyan theology and cultural competency. And you've shared, I think, a number of, you know, things that you're learning about that. Right. Anything else that you want to share with us about that intersection, and that would be helpful? What kind of things you're studying?
Yeah, I think, one of the pieces that I've been trying to pay attention to is this concept of imago Dei, of being made in the image of God. And if you look at this book by Christopher Wright called The Mission of God, I think that's the title of the book, Mission of God. He talks about the challenge that is before us, that we, because we live in such myopic perspectives, we have a hard time broadening the categories of who fits into that imago Dei. If you look at Wesleyan theology, Andrew was telling you that one of the other passions I have is Wesleyan theology. John Wesley was very committed to crossing a lot of boundaries. He was not okay with the state of the poor in his country. He was not okay with the issues of slavery that were present in his time. And so he was able to listen to the biblical text and what it says about those issues, and he was able to respond. In fact, John Wesley was the one who encouraged and empowered William Wilberforce from North America to really take up this charge of saying the inhuman treatment of others is not of God. And so the reason I'm passionate about Wesleyan theology is because I believe that there is truth that needs to be understood. It's almost like we have to extrapolate, like we haven't fully unearthed the richness that is embedded in a Wesleyan theological understanding. When he says, in fact, John Wesley has a sermon on the image of God, right, Andrew? You and I worked on that with Dr. Howard Snyder's class. So what does John Wesley mean when he says imago Dei? And his interpretation is in line with the biblical interpretation that all persons are made in the image of God. And so I want us to be able to challenge ourselves and challenge those that we work with. How do we include the other in our circles? The other piece that comes to mind specifically with John Wesley's theology, because he was a big proponent of grace, prevenient grace, salvific grace. If you look at these concepts, now again with grace, I discovered that we don't use grace in the same way that it was perhaps intended to be. We as Christian institutions, both institutions of, higher ed or institutions of churches or missional organizations, we have made grace a commodity to have easy access to, right? Like, in fact, just recently I heard someone say, I'm just a grace kind of guy. And I'm like, what do you really mean by saying I'm a grace kind of guy? Does grace mean that you allow someone to live in their wrong thinking and wrong behaving? I think grace is really the opportunity for us to correct ourselves and to help others see perhaps something that they might be missing. So those are just a couple of things on my mind, Andrew, when you ask me about, what other things that we really need to be paying attention to. Is, grace. I mean, today's the first day of Lent, right? Today's Ash Wednesday.
That's right.
And we're talking about grace. Grace has cost. It has costed someone something, and it has become available to us. And oftentimes, because we live so far removed from the experience of the church in the first century or the disciples of Jesus' time, that perhaps it's hard to have a feel for what that cost may have felt to the people that were closest to these historical events that took place, right? Of Christ dying, like that's what I'm referring to. Like what I am confident that it felt of significant value. And as it has traveled through time and down to us in the 21st century, I hope that we will find a way to carry the significance and the value of this gift that we have received in Christ. I'm going to pause there, Andrew.
That's awesome. No, that's really great, Esther. So we're going to open up for the next 10 minutes or so for some questions. I'll start off with a question. Can you give an example of how cultural competency can be an asset in an interaction? And then another example about how cultural competency can actually, or a lack of cultural competency maybe can cause issues, like where you've seen places where someone has had cultural competency and interacted well, and then another place where they have lacked it and it's caused a problem.
Yeah. So one of the experiences that I'm being reminded of was actually at my annual conference, at the Kentucky annual conference. And you know, it occurred with the clergy colleague who was of a different ethnicity than myself. And the context of the context where this, the context in which this exchange occurred was that we were attending a meeting for the ethnic churches in the Kentucky annual conference. So there were leaders from the ethnic congregations present in this room. And it was interesting because I made a comment about cultural competency. I actually was making a presentation on cultural competency. And this person just stood up and said to me, there is no way that you as an Indian can understand what we as Hispanics or Blacks or Caucasians go through. And it led to a series of very uncomfortable exchanges, as you might perhaps recall your own. If you have ever served in a church context, you know that it's not really hard to find challenging situations. They are very readily available. Disagreements, misunderstandings. And so the person just harbored the wrong understanding rather than asking me to explain myself further or to say, you know, what did you mean by this? Rather than just jump to a conclusion and make a statement that because I was not of the ethnicity that this person was from, that I just didn't understand them, right? So that is an example of a situation that could have been remedied if the person would have approached it by saying, help me understand what you mean by this, rather than make conclusive statements.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Right? Or let me give you a more everyday experience that happens in our society at large. And I'll try to keep this a little bit more general as much as possible. But oftentimes I encounter situations where a student of one ethnicity will say, you know, this person just doesn't understand me, and I don't understand why they have all of these opportunities and I don't have any of these opportunities. Well, let's engage in a conversation. So a culturally competent situation would be where somebody actually invites more conversation than shuts it down. So if you find yourself shutting a conversation down, that should raise a red flag in your mind, and you should pull yourself back and say, let me do this a different way. And a different way would be to really allow the other person to explain themselves. Oftentimes, when I try to explain myself, if we really pay attention to what we're saying, we're actually trying to justify what we've just said. If you really look at the basic level of human, behavior, oftentimes we're really just trying to justify what we have done or what we have said. So there you go, Andrew.
Esther, thank you so much for what you've shared. There's so many, I don't know, I have got a lot of questions and thoughts kind of going through my mind and that sort of thing, but trying to bring this, part of this is trying to bring what you're talking about back into the local church. And there's a lot of different angles that we could take in that sort of thing. But one thought that I have, or one question I have, is talk to us about those of us who are missions pastors or maybe youth pastors who are leading teams overseas into other cultures. What are some of the skills or things that we need to know or be aware of or bring into our maybe pre-trip planning when it comes to cultural competency? What are some, is there some skills, some learned behaviors, some, what elements or how can we bring what you're talking about along with this when we're traveling to other countries?
So one thing, Nate, that comes to mind, I want to go back to, the CQ. I was trying to explain what cultural intelligence is, and it begins with the awareness and the knowledge piece. So how well do you understand and how informed are you about the culture? And, maybe you should pay attention to those things that are similar and to those things that are different. Right? So when we engage in mission work, as we go to other countries, we need to be cognizant of what are the things we share in common and what are the things that might be unique. The one thing to keep in mind is different doesn't mean bad. Oftentimes, I have discovered that if something is different, it has the connotation of being bad. And we need to recognize that different is not bad. Different actually has the potential to help us have another way of thinking about issues at hand, right? So knowledge would be very critical, but within knowledge, you look at that which is similar and that which is different. Then you go into, I kind of want to complete this circle of CQ, right? So you start with knowledge, you go into strategy. And what strategy really means is how are you planning for your intercultural interactions, right? So what kind of a posture do you have? Are you going in to learn? Are you going in to understand? The best thing I had ever heard in one of my first anthropology classes is that our strategy needs to be one of learning and listening, learning to know the questions to ask. And those are the pieces that really help us identify what our strategy needs to be, how we will interact or respond in a particular situation, right? So if you go into, if you go into Kenya, and people are in need of food, but you decide to build them wells, you're really not listening to what the need is. You try to interpret what you hear, but ask for interpretation instead. Keep asking, what do you mean by this? Tell us more, like what is the need? And Nate, one of the challenges we have is we need to be aware of how mission history has worked itself out over the decades. And that's why I wanted to bring the contextual theology piece into our discussion, because a lot of the classic mission work has appeared to be an imposition of one culture over another. So we have ended up focusing more on the kernel of what it looks like to be the Christian. Maybe kernel is not the right, the outside of a Christian, right? The clothes we wear, the food, the language we speak, which movies we watch, rather than the internal piece, which is the transformation of the heart. So we need to continue to educate ourselves on what are we trying to transmit? Are we trying to transmit my way, your way, or are we trying to transmit the message that there is redemption for all in Jesus Christ, and let the Holy Spirit, do the work? So that's knowledge, strategy. The other piece that's critical is drive, and what that means, if you go to the CQ website, you will find that drive means one's level of interest, persistence, and confidence. Now, I have grown up in 2 different cultures, and it has taken all of this time to be able to create a whole new culture for myself. So when I am in India, I don't fully fit in that context. And when I'm in North America, I don't fully fit in that context. But it is a cumulative experience that allows me to become more comfortable. So I have a drive, I have an interest, and I want to persist in learning about other cultures and how other people work. The final piece is action, and I did refer to that earlier. And what action means is our ability to adapt when relating and working in different contexts. So I have had to learn, when I entered the North American context, I had to learn, how do people in North America function? What is life like here? What are relationships like? So I think we can be mindful of so many things. And along with all of this, I want to remind us that cultural intelligence, cultural responsibility really emerges from a posture. It's not just a skill. I think there is a posture that we need to maintain, and that is one of acknowledging the other, respecting the other, having a sense of empathy towards the other as much as possible. Right?
That's
One thing I like, sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
That's really helpful. I like that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, Jesus Christ, like in all of the parables, if you really read them closely, you see that he really entered the context of the person he was trying to reach. It was never about asking them to come into his context, because that came at the end on its own because of the way Jesus approached the people. Whether it's the woman that was caught in the, act of adultery, or whether it was Zacchaeus on the tree, Jesus entered the context and gave an invitation through the posture that he had. So, sorry, Nate, I could keep going on, but these are some small steps that we can start taking. There's a lot more to build on, but these are some of the small steps that we can start.
I love that idea of posture. I think that idea of posture is really helpful. And I want to go back to something you said. You talked about asking for interpretation. I think that's really, really helpful. I think oftentimes we ask a question and we assume that we understand the answer. But I think that somebody who's really trying to understand a context hears an answer and then asks another question about that answer to continue to dig deeper and deeper, because the meaning is often not in the answer, but in the way that answer is understood within that context. I love that. So we have 2 more questions we want to get to in the next couple minutes before we close down. So I'm going to ask the first one, and it is, you use the phrase salvific grace. How would you define salvific grace different than like prevenient grace? So these are really, really theological terms, and this comes from our friend John Johnson, who's very theological. But I'd love to know, like, when you use the term salvific grace, is that different or the same as the way that you think about prevenient grace or preventing grace?
John, thank you for your question. And I think at this point, what I can say, I'm not sure that it's very different, but prevenient grace is understood as the grace we have when we're not even aware of it, right? Salvific grace, there is a level of awareness involved in that. So I am aware now as a person who has chosen to have Jesus Christ as my Savior, that I live in the salvific grace, right? Not in the prevenient grace, which is just grace that may have a sense of unknown presence, right? So that is probably how I would distinguish it. But
and these are all part of John Wesley. If you want to, John Wesley and his threefold views of grace. So you can go and look more at that. You know, if you went to Wesley, I learned more about John Wesley in the couple years that I was at Asbury than I ever knew prior. And a joke was made that John Wesley's name was probably spoken as much as Jesus's name in some of those classes. So there's a lot of great theology there, though, that's great to look into. One more question, Nate.
Yeah, one more question. We'll end on this one. But Steve asked, what are some of the most effective and practical ways to raise the CQ of a local body of believers? So for the local church, and you probably have to make some assumptions on where a church is located and the makeup of the body and that sort of thing. But just overall, some general and practical ways that we can raise the level of CQ.
Sure. Steve, that's a great question. Thank you for that. The first thing that comes to mind is if you have access to people that are from different cultures and ethnicities, invite them into your congregation. Set up a time to know them, perhaps for them to share as simple things as where they come from, what was their life like, right? So having persons come and visit your congregation. The other would be, and Andrew has access to this information, have your congregation or your leadership team of the church take the CQ assessment. And I would be happy to be of help if that is helpful, because I am a certified CQ person, and so I can walk you through the interpretation of the results and what they mean. So if you have leadership teams that you're working with, have them take the CQ assessment. The other would be to, take advantage of the opportunities that might be in your context. So for example, what I mean by that is I live here in Wilmore and I work at Asbury University. I'm always looking for culturally focused events that I can send my students to. So Asbury students have now been to the Centre College, they've been to UK to listen to different speakers and different perspectives. And so if you have access to that, go for it. Take those opportunities that may be available. So doing the assessment, inviting people into your midst, seeking opportunities that are in the neighborhood where you're at, even maybe hosting cultural festivals, celebrating different cultures. So if you have people in your community that are willing to help in that, then have cultural celebrations. So on our campus at Asbury, we have Latino festivals, we have a Black History Month, we're getting ready to have a Caribbean night. So just bring these features to your community. And it could even be simply through a movie and having a discussion pre and post movie, right? So those are some
That's awesome.
Basic ideas.
Esther, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. In the chat section, I added the link to the Cultural Intelligence Center, which is where you can get some of that information on testing. It's culturalq.com, so go check that out. And then Esther, is it okay to share your email address if people want to contact you?
Sure, Andrew, and thank you.
If you say no now, it's really awkward because I've already asked you, in public in front of everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Esther. You were a water hose of information, at least for me and for everybody else. that was listening and watching. So it was very nice to meet you, and we will be praying for you as you finish out your
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for having me here. And if I can be of help, please feel free to reach out.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Esther's email address for those that are watching this later is Esther, Esther.Jadhav, Jadhav, at asbury.edu. Esther, thanks for being with us. And we'll see you guys next time, April 17th with Samir. We look forward to that conversation.